Jung despised philosophers, but the truth was that he was projecting his own weakness onto them. And when he was confronted, his shadow emerged, revealing something he would never admit in public. The greatest psychologist of the 20th century, a man who explored the darkest corners of the human mind, had an almost irrational hatred for certain philosophers. But the reason wasn't just theoretical, it was personal. He didn't just disagree, he attacked them ferociously, ridiculing their thoughts as if they were dangerous or useless. But why? Jung said that philosophy was full of people who threw words to the wind, who did not understand the human psyche. But what if, deep down, he was fighting something inside himself? This brings us to the real question. Was Jung really criticizing the ideas of philosophers? Or was he projecting something deeper? It all starts when Jung says, "Neurosis messes up the mind of any philosopher because he is not in harmony with himself. Your way of thinking is, in fact, an organized fight against your own doubts." Jung despised existentialist philosophers, but what I found in his letters revealed something even more shocking. But there was something strange about it all. Jung didn't just criticize philosophers, he attacked them as if they were a real threat. But what made this rejection so intense? He called Heidegger neurotic, said Nietzsche overflowed with wounded sexuality, and saw Kierkegaard as a crybaby. But there was a curious detail. Jung despised those he had barely read. Isn't that strange? How could a man obsessed with the unconscious and the truth be so emotionally reactive against thinkers he barely knew? This was not just an intellectual conflict. This was personal. Jung spent his life studying the unconscious. He knew that what we reject most in others often hides what we fear most within ourselves. So the question is inevitable. Did Jung hate these philosophers? Or did he hate something he saw in himself? Interestingly, despite the force of his criticisms, Jung rarely mentioned philosophers in his writings. He respected Socrates, made some references to Plato and Kant, but beyond that, his opinions were mostly negative, especially about the philosophers who came after Kant. Jung ridiculed Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Heidegger, but the most curious thing, he hadn't even read most of his works. His criticism was more emotional than intellectual. But why? That made everything even stranger. Perhaps the answer lies in his relationship with Nietzsche. Nietzsche held a special place in Jung's mind. The German thinker was, at the same time, a troubled mind and an inexhaustible source of inspiration. His ideas resonated strongly with many aspects of Jungian work, but they also represented something Jung feared, a psyche consumed by chaos. Would this reveal something deeper about Jung's rejection of philosophy? In this video, we will explore this unusual relationship between Jung and philosophy. In the first part of the episode, we will explore the many accusations that Jung made against these philosophers. Then, in the second part, I want to take a closer look at what might be behind this. Let's delve deeper into this comment he made to Freud and follow the suggestion of Nietzsche's famous translator, Walter Kaufmann, who noticed the influence of Jung's shadow in these extremely emotional comments about philosophers. I will defend the idea that Jung's contempt for these thinkers, with whom he had little or no direct contact, reveals a conflict within his own mind. This conflict occurs between what he calls personality number 1 and personality number 2. As we will see, this theme appears repeatedly both in his life and in his writings, with the philosopher representing the symbolic image of something that Jung did not experience. Jung's criticisms of philosophers can be divided into two categories. First, Jung accuses philosophers of exceeding their own limits. Then he criticizes them, as we saw in the opening quote, for being mentally unstable. On the first point, he is irritated by the fact that philosophers go beyond what they can understand and that they do not follow a scientific path. His criticism is not just limited to Heidegger and Kierkegaard, but also includes Hegel and German philosophy as a whole. He goes so far as to write, "Besides, all this intellectual perversion is a German national tradition." In one of his letters, Jung states that any type of speculation that goes beyond the capabilities of the moment is nothing more than a disguise to hide one's own lack of creativity. In another letter, he says that philosophical criticism needs to be based on concrete facts. Otherwise, it will remain floating in the air and will be condemned to uselessness. In yet another correspondence, he criticizes philosophers of the Heidegger school, saying that they just play with words. And when writing to the author of a book on psychotherapy and philosophy, he mocks the way philosophers deal with death. An especially fun part is the way philosophers talk about death. I can't wait for essays like How is Death Possible? Or The Philosophical Foundations of Death. Forgive these irreverent impulses of mine, they come from practical experience, where the weakness of philosophical language appears with full clarity. From what he learned from this author, he says, "What Heidegger, Klages, and Jaspers say about this never impacted me very deeply, because it is possible to notice the same pattern in all the writers who never had to deal with the real challenges of psychotherapy. They all master words with impressive ease, giving them an almost magical power. If Klages had to treat a single case of neurosis, he would never have written that extensive book on the unpleasant spirit. In the same way, Heidegger would have completely lost interest in juggling words. For Jung, philosophy was not science. It was just an elegant excuse to vomit one's unconscious prejudices, and he didn't forgive that. As his letters were written in a private context, it is interesting to see Jung allowing himself to use sharper, more humorous language. In one of them, he comments, "There is no such thing as thought as thought. Sometimes it is the piss of unconscious demons." And in another great sentence from one of the letters, he writes about Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety. The philosopher starts from the anxiety that possesses him, and then, through reflection, transforms his subjective state of being possessed into a perception of anxiety. Question: is it an object worthy of anxiety or an armchair? A word I had to look up, meaning a cowardly act, basically, of the ego shitting its pants? Jung's idea here is reminiscent of Nietzsche's thinking about the prejudices of philosophers in Beyond Good and Evil, where he writes that most of a philosopher's conscious thought is secretly guided and forced into certain channels by his instincts. Among all philosophers, Heidegger seems to occupy a special place in Jung's thought. Probably at the time, most of these letters were written. During the 1930s, Heidegger was at the height of his fame. Jung comments that Heidegger is irritated by the previously mentioned unconscious subjective prejudices and that he tries in vain to hide behind exaggerated language. He describes Heidegger's writing as nonsense, and when a colleague read an excerpt from his work at a conference, Jung found the experience truly comical. The substance of what he read was unspeakably useless and banal, and Brinkmann could well have done it to make Heidegger ridiculous. In short, this is the first part of Jung's critique of philosophers. He claims that philosophy is always going beyond its own limits. We could perhaps call this a kind of Kantian discipline. Jung wants to preserve a scientific approach, focused on what can actually be known. He writes that philosophy has yet to learn that it is made by human beings and depends to an alarming degree on their psychic constitution. And this psychic constitution is, in Jung's opinion, all too often and deeply neurotic. As we saw in the opening, quote, "Neurosis messes up the mind of any philosopher because he is not in harmony with himself. Your way of thinking is, in fact, an organized fight against your own doubts." Jung makes some direct criticisms of philosophers in these letters. He says Hegel is about to explode with conceit and vanity, while Nietzsche overflows with wounded sexuality. He expresses this confessional tone even more intensely than Nietzsche. As for Kierkegaard, Jung repeatedly describes him as grizzled, a term I had to look up. I discovered that gray means something like the behavior of a child who cries irritably, or, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, crying continuously but not too loudly, or complaining all the time. In other words, Jung basically called Kierkegaard a crybaby. Regarding the brilliance of the Danish philosopher, Jung writes that Kierkegaard was a stimulating and pioneering force precisely because of his neurosis. True to form, he maintains his harshest feelings for Heidegger, going so far as to say that Jung saw Heidegger as a man trapped in his own mind, irritable, neurotic, and unable to see beyond his own words. His kindred spirits, near and far, sit in lunatic asylums, some as patients and others as psychiatrists in a philosophical turmoil. This neurosis is an essential part of what lies behind their philosophies, the insecurity they feel about themselves, as if they were walking on thin ice, which could break at any moment and sink them into the icy waters below, is the central point of their ideas. The doubt created by this neurosis in those affected ends up contaminating the way they see others and the world around them. As Jung says, neurosis is a self-justified doubt and continually poses the ultimate question of trust in man and in God. Doubt is creative if it is answered by actions, and so is neurosis if it exonerates itself as having been a phase, a crisis which is pathological only when chronic. Neurosis is a prolonged crisis degenerated into a habit, the ready-made daily catastrophe. This neuroticism is perhaps clearest in Kierkegaard, whose philosophical way of seeing God led him, in a neurotic way, to solve everything in study without having to face it in real life. In a later letter, Jung thinks about how Kierkegaard used philosophy to avoid facing life, especially when reflecting on the breakup of the Danish philosopher's engagement to his fiancée Regine. Reading his detailed account of Kierkegaard, I was once again struck by the discrepancy between the perpetual talk about fulfilling God's will and the reality. When God appeared to him in the form of Regina, he ran away. It was too terrible for him to have to subordinate his autocratism to someone else's love. Ultimately, Jung's view of philosophers is that they are suffering from a pathological hypertrophy of intellectual intuition. He makes this diagnosis directly about Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, but he would probably have no problem applying the same label to Kierkegaard and Heidegger. For Jung, philosophers did not explore the world. They just projected their own insecurities onto him. And generally, what this reveals about them is not something very positive. What emerges is a picture of philosophers as a group of neurotic people, leaking their own unconscious biases into the world. But this contradiction of Jung's did not come out of nowhere. It reflects a conflict that he carried within himself since childhood, the battle between his two personalities. When examining what Jung says about philosophers, we can see that he has two points of view, a philosophical and a psychological one. The psychological point is that he believes everyone is a little out of it, while the philosophical point focuses on the critical line between what can and cannot be known. For Jung, this question of what can be known is a boundary between science and philosophy. This tension is very personal to him, and understanding it in Jung's mind may explain why his feelings toward philosophy after Kant are so strong. By understanding this personal aspect in his psyche, we can see an unlived life that perhaps manifests itself in his emotional rejection of philosophy. In his autobiographical book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung talks about the division within his mind between what he called personality number 1 and personality number 2. As a child, he already recognized these two personalities and the differences between them. One of them was my parents' son, who went to school and was less intelligent, attentive, hard-working, decent, and clean than many other boys. The other, personality number 2, was an adult, old in fact, skeptical, suspicious, distant from the world of men, but close to nature, the earth, the sun, the moon, the weather, all living creatures, and above all close to the night, dreams, and any god who worked directly in it. When Jung was at school and needed to choose what he would study at university, he found himself torn between science, on the one hand, and human or historical studies, on the other. The practical approach to the sciences appealed to him, but it was the desire to understand meaning that led him to become interested in human studies. He said, "The older I grew, the more often my parents and other people asked me what I wanted to be. I had no clear notions about this. My interests took me in different directions. On the one hand, I felt strongly attracted to science with its fact-based truths. On the other hand, I was fascinated by everything to do with comparative religion. In the sciences, I was mainly attracted to zoology, paleontology, and geology. In the humanities, to Greco-Roman, Egyptian, and prehistoric archaeology. At that time, of course, I did not realize how much this choice of the most varied subjects corresponded to the nature of my inner dichotomy. What attracted me to science were the concrete facts and their historical context, and to comparative religion the spiritual problems, which philosophy also entered. In science, I missed the meaning factor, and in religion, that of empiricism. Science has largely met the needs of personality number 1, while human or historical studies have provided beneficial instruction for personality number 2. In the end, he decided to follow the path of science, but as his career progressed, he became increasingly drawn to the interests of his other personality. When Jung and Freud were still close friends, and Jung was seen as Freud's likely successor, the father of psychoanalysis wrote to Jung, "I know that your deepest inclinations are urging you to the study of the occult, and do not doubt that you will return home with a rich load. There is no way to stop this, and it is always right for a person to follow the orders of their own impulses. The reputation you gained with your dementia," Freud is referring here to Jung's highly respected paper on schizophrenia, which at the time was called Dementia Praecox, "will stand against the charge of mysticism for a long time. Just don't stray too far from us in lush tropical colonies. It is necessary to govern at home." Still, Jung continued to feel a tension between these two personalities and the worlds to which they belonged. He realized that, When looking at the world from the perspective of personality number 1, nature presented itself as an object of scientific study, while from the perspective of personality number 2, it was experienced as a mysterious and ineffable realm, which he often described as God's world in memoirs, dreams, and reflections. Of course, these two forces were not always in conflict. In fact, it appears that during the period of psychotic visions between November 1913 and April 1918, which later became the Red Book, it was science that helped him stay anchored in reality. My science was the only way I could free myself from that chaos. Otherwise, the material would have trapped me in its thicket, strangling me like jungle vines. I took great care to try to understand each image, each item in my psychic inventory, and classify them scientifically, as far as possible, and above all, realize them in real life. From this brief overview of Jung's relationship with science, we have something quite revealing regarding his comments on philosophers. In what Walter Kaufmann describes as Jung's overly emotional response to the existentialist philosophers, we see, as Kaufmann points out, Jung's own shadow, although he himself fails to see it on this occasion. The aggressiveness of his criticism goes far beyond the proto-existentialist philosophers, Heidegger or Kierkegaard. As we have already seen, he goes so far as to reject the entire German philosophical tradition as an intellectual perversion. Jung's strong rejection of philosophers may, in the end, reveal more about him than about these philosophical figures. Here we can find a possible reflection of Jung's idea of an unlived life. Jung chose to pursue science, but he delved deeper into the world of philosophy, spirituality, and religion. He found himself divided, as if he were hanging on a cross. On the one hand, there was the desire to be a scientist, and on the other, the desire to be a philosopher. The empiricism and skepticism of scientists have always hampered their philosophical work. Using Jung's terminology, his ego always wanted to be a scientist, but his soul kept calling him to the world of humanities. Hence his words, "I'm the worst dilettante that ever lived. I wanted to achieve something in my science, and then I was plunged into this lava flow and had to classify everything." There was something of the dilettante's insecurity in Jung's comment about philosophers who criticized their collective unconscious. I can tolerate any criticism as long as it is based on facts or real knowledge. But what I experienced in the form of philosophical critique of my concept of the collective unconscious, for example, was characterized by woeful ignorance on the one hand and intellectual prejudice on the other. Jung's relationship with philosophy seemed to be quite complicated. It's like an intense conflict between the two parts of your personality, number 1 and number 2. On the one hand, the number 1 personality, with its scientific tendencies, rejects anything that goes beyond the limits of what can be proven. This part of his personality, which appears in his criticisms of philosophers, is always in conflict with the other part of his mind. Jung's critique of philosophers is all the more interesting because, as Kaufmann pointed out, Jung repeatedly boasted that he knew philosophy in general and Nietzsche in particular, as Freud did not. In a letter, when asked about Hegel's influence on his thought, Jung responds that this influence does not exist, as he never read the philosopher. However, to the extent that he knew Hegel, he writes that, "It has always been my opinion that Hegel was a psychologist manqué," another word I had to look up. The Oxford Dictionary defines manqué as having failed to become what one could have been, just as I am a philosopher manqué. Here we can see that Jung presents a certain feeling of imposter when it comes to his philosophical side and his work beyond empiricism. As we saw with personalities 1 and 2, this tension exists long before any specialization in psychology. However, it ends up being a factor that amplifies this internal struggle. And for a 67-year-old man who sees things this way, there is a constant feeling of what could have been different. So as we look at these philosophers, especially Heidegger, who delve into what Jung describes as God's world, a place to which he feels a strong attraction and gives himself over, we can also see Jung's greatest fears about his own work, that everything he does is in reality a neurotic projection of his own unconscious subjective prejudices. This fear becomes even more present when we think about the many people who have since accused Jung of this. However, we can also perceive perhaps one of Jung's greatest desires, to be recognized as the dilettante always wants. We cannot help but question whether the strength of Jung's criticisms hides some type of jealousy. Hegel, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger were highly respected. They had great influence on theology, and it is clear that Jung wanted this too. However, this neurotic tension between his philosophical side and his scientific personality made his trajectory in this field difficult. In the Red Book, we find the line, "Keep it away from me, science, that intelligent connoisseur, that evil prison master who binds the soul and imprisons it in a lightless cell." This line perhaps speaks deeply to the dark tension that philosophy held for Jung. It's important to note that this doesn't mean Jung was completely wrong. His criticisms of Heidegger, especially his excessive use of words, are something that has been repeated by many since Being and Time was published in 1928, and in my opinion, the way he assesses Kierkegaard's estrangement from his fiancée Regine seems to capture well what was going on in Kierkegaard's neurotic mind. What I want to highlight is that Jung's reaction to these philosophers seems to reveal something about himself. He shows no understanding towards Heidegger. There is no attempt to really understand or consider his ideas. For Jung, it is just a jumble of words and nothing more. He believes that the fact that other thinkers take Heidegger seriously reveals, as he mentioned about Kierkegaard, the theological neurosis of his time, rather than recognizing any genuine value. When Heidegger's words are read at a conference, Jung finds them somewhat comical and unclear. And of course, he also makes a very strong comparison, saying that people like Heidegger end up in lunatic asylums, both patients and professionals who indulge too much in this kind of thinking. He doesn't simply try to ignore what he can't understand. Instead, he greets it with criticism and diagnosis, which, while perhaps making sense in the case of Kierkegaard, about whom Jung apparently read a little, seems more a reflection of something deeper in relation to Heidegger, about whom he knows very little or nothing. At the end of one of these letters, he seems to realize that perhaps he has gone too far. "Sorry for these blasphemies. They arise from my hygienic propensities because I hate to see so many young minds infected by Heidegger. This crucial final clause can tell us a lot." It is interesting to note which philosophers Jung decides to attack. He does not criticize Kant, Descartes, or Spinoza, although any of them could also be considered as someone who goes beyond their own limits in a neurotic way. As we have seen, Jung never went beyond Kant when it came to philosophy. Because of this lack of knowledge, Jung could admit that his understanding was incomplete, or he could take an easier path and simply dismiss the work of these philosophers as reflecting a neurosis. But in Kant's case, which is central to Jung's work, he makes no such accusation, even though the label could be applied equally. I suspect that behind Jung's disdain at seeing so many young minds influenced by Heidegger may lie a dynamic of imitation and competition. This tendency to compete is visible in Jung's letters to Freud, in which he talks about how psychoanalysis would take control of psychiatric society in Switzerland and how they, together, would take control in Germany. Your cause is to win at every stage, so that we have the last word. In fact, we're on top of the world. To this letter from 1909, Freud replied, "Are we not justifiably childish for deriving so much pleasure from every slightest recognition when in reality it matters so little, and our final conquest of the world is still so far ahead?" In the end, Jung did not attack philosophers. He tried to silence a voice inside him. He was fighting himself. Perhaps deep down he feared that his own mind was as adrift as those he criticized. Perhaps he rejected Heidegger because he feared that his work was also just empty words. Perhaps he attacked Nietzsche because he saw in him a disturbing mirror, a man consumed by his own psyche. And maybe, just maybe, Jung projected his own shadow onto these philosophers just as we all project ours. Perhaps Jung never fought philosophers. Maybe he was fighting a fear deep inside him. And maybe, in the end, we are all doing the same thing.